Hi. There's been a lot of debate, certainly in the States, where some indigenous people stood up in Denver.
Yes.
Because they're, especially like with ayahuasca, there's a lot of protocols and indigenous knowledge that encompasses that particular medicine, also iboga. And what we're seeing is a disconnect. At the very beginning, there was a recognition of the indigenous wisdoms that come from these plant medicines, and I wouldn't even call them psychedelics, they're more plant medicines. But what we're seeing as it's becoming, the science is becoming more, coming more online, is this disconnect between the indigenous wisdom that brought it into the West and now a profit-making venture capitalist system that wants to, I would say, kind of biopiracy, utilize what has been something that has been indigenous for profit. Secondly, there's a real disconnect between what the VCs are doing scientifically and what's going on in the black market, very much like cannabis, because you can go out and pick mushrooms, magic mushrooms, and a lot of people will continue to do that and take mushrooms on a regular basis, and that has never stopped. Likewise, with indigenous people will still come to the UK and offer medicine, and so with other people. How are we going to bridge what's becoming a real disconnect between psychedelic, venture capitalism and science and indigenous wisdom, shamanism and plant medicines?
I'll let Sean deal with the hard questions about the venture capital. I'll deal with the easy one, which is, of course, we're extremely sympathetic. I start all my talks by pointing out the fact that ayahuasca is really the first properly constructed polypharmaceutical agent in the history of the world. It's two substances which need to be together to work. There are several thousand years ahead of Western pharmacologists like me. That's the first thing to say. And the second thing is that that we can learn a lot from the traditional approaches. And one of the areas that I find particularly appealing is the idea of therapy in groups, and that gets to some of the questions or the challenges that Sean raised about the cost of providing these treatments, because as I said early on, we tend to have very intensive one-on-one therapy, often with two therapists to one patient. But maybe we could learn from the traditional approach and do it better by having people engaged in group therapy. And what we're seeing, and this intrigues me a lot, is that very often military veterans are going and being treated in groups, and that kind of makes sense to me, because they're usually damaged in groups. Normally they're injured when they're out in platoons, and one or two of them dead, and others have got bits blown off, and they've got traumatic brain injuries, etc. And I think healing in a group might be particularly appealing for people who've been harmed as a group. So I think there's quite a lot we can use. How we repay the indigenous peoples with the knowledge, well, I think the way we do it is actually pretty straightforward, is we protect them. And there are huge programs now going on which are trying to stop the extraction of the ayahuasca vine from the Amazon, and there are new plantations of ibogaine plants being developed in West Africa, and of course, the peyote cactus is now protected, and there are investors who growing again tracts of peyote cactus for mescaline. So I think it's perfectly possible for the West to repay the debt, and we should be.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with that. I think we owe a lot to the ancient. We're relearning, right? As a civilization, we are relearning. We're relearning these plant medicines are beneficial for us. They're not drugs and they're not harmful. But we're also relearning ways of healing, spiritual ways of healing. And part of that is acknowledging where that comes from. And it does come from the traditional and the ancient tribes, particularly those in South America who were brutalized as a result of it by the Spanish conquistadors. But equally, when you look at the ancient Greece and the mysteries of Eleusis, they were brutalized by the Catholic Church. And so I think there's a lot of nuances with respect to where all of these traditions come from. I would advise you to read a book by Brian Muraretscu, which is really helpful in terms of understanding where a lot of these traditions come from. I think that there are two very distinct industries within the discussion we're having right now. So the one industry is retreats, where people are taking the plant extract, they're having their mushrooms, or they're going to Peru and they're doing, in some cases, almost industrial size ayahuasca retreats, 30, 40, 50, up to 100 people in a session, where these ingredients are being depleted in the forest. And absolutely, I think there's a reckoning that will be paid for that. But what we are trying to do as a VC is quite distinct from that. Firstly, what we're doing from an intellectual property perspective doesn't stop anyone from having their plant experiences. It doesn't stop anyone from buying mushrooms. Nothing's going to end, right? These are companies that are taking on $800, $900 million jobs of trying to get these drugs through so they can treat not the few amounts of people who can pay for a plant experience, which are expensive, the few people that know a dealer where they can get access to drugs. This is not for those people. What we are investing in is for the millions, the 69 million people around the world suffering from treatment-resistant depression who have failed at 2 other treatments already. These are people who often can't get out of bed, they're often suicidal, and they don't have the connections or the wherewithal to go find a dealer and microdose or do this by themselves. So what we're doing is we're trying to do it responsibly by paying back these indigenous cultures. Many of the companies that we are invested in are B corporations. They give part of their profits back, profits that might realize in the future, that might not. And I think what David says is right, which is just we have to do it responsibly. We have to be aware that we're part of a larger ecosystem. But I also want to be incredibly, I'm very strong about this point. What we're investing in is meant to be helping millions of people, not the few thousands of people who have access. And I think that's really the crux of it for me.
Good.
Hi, I have a question. So I am a doctor, and I found myself very reluctant to tell my colleagues that I'll be coming here today because there's a lot of prejudice in the medical community about psychedelics and all recreational drugs. My question for you is, how do we expect the general population and the government to change the way they think about these drugs when the people who are meant to have the most information don't have the correct information? All I learned in medical school is that they're bad and harmful, and yeah.
Yeah. So if you read the book, you'll find that's what I want too. And I think the answer is we bypass medicine. I mean, truly, it's embarrassing, absolutely. And what we don't want to recapitulate what happened with medical cannabis, where the medical profession became adamant that because they hadn't discovered it and invented it, they weren't going to use it. That's an absolute travesty, and we can talk about that. And Edward here as a QC, we're working with to try to challenge the medical profession who are still refusing to prescribe medical cannabis to children where it's life-saving. So with psychedelics, I think the position's going to be slightly different. The first is we do have a lot more science. We do understand psychedelics better. We do have clinical trials. At least 1,000 patients have been treated in modern trials, and we've got the historic numbers, like maybe 40,000 patients historically. So there's an awful lot of knowledge, but I don't see medicine embracing it without quite a lot of education. And the reality is, I think, and the strategy we're taking is we want the patients to drive this because they have the need, and it might be slightly easier with psychedelics and medical cannabis because we're actually talking. Are you a psychiatrist? So largely we're talking, even the most negative psychiatrists would have to accept that there hasn't really been any innovation. So it might be slightly easier to get it through that group. But it is, I think, medicine is a very resistant and challenging power block. And whatever you can do to promote the word, and do it.
Hello. I have a question on the the therapy side of things. Of course, you're mixing therapy and psychedelics most of the time as what you talked before.
Yeah.
So my question is there any specific type of therapy that works better with psychedelics, and do psychedelics open people more up to therapy afterwards as opposed to before taking them? Thank you.
Yes, so the answer is there's no systematic studies of therapy. I mean, we use a type of therapy called sort of acceptance and commitment therapy. People, it's a kind of mindfulness-based therapy, but there's there've been no systematic studies. The second part of your question, does I think psychedelics do. I think we find that patients who've come to us, almost all of them have had CBT. They've all failed on it, which means they hate it because it's further fuels their belief that they're useless. We don't do CBT afterwards, but we certainly find that they're more able and more to think differently about the past and to be much more creative and more open-minded about the future. So I think it almost certainly will make people more able to engage in therapy. And just to emphasize, repeat what I said earlier, it may be a sub-psychedelic dose would also facilitate that. So in our OCD study, which is halfway through now, our patients with OCD, even though they got severe OCD, said they would never countenance losing control in a trip. So we're not able to give them a trip. But what we are doing is using a lower dose, a non-trip dose, to facilitate or to loosen up their connections, their obsessive circuits, so that they might engage better in other forms of therapy. And we're finding that they do, that even a sub-psychedelic dose does have this ability to help people think differently. So that may be another way forward.
Thank you very much.
I think we've got time for one last question.
Hiya. So at a lot of these psychedelic ceremonies in a traditional context, you have music playing all night. And I was kind of interested in what you were mentioning at the Imperial trials, where there's a playlist. And in a lot of these indigenous cultures, it's in a, whatever, you get my picture.
Yeah.
Do you think this is, from a psychopharmacological clinical perspective, part of the purported healing of these compounds, or is this just something nice, a red herring? Or is that core to the experience?
That's a really good question. The answer is probably both. For some people, it can be very... So in our first depression study, there was a relationship between the appreciation of the music and outcome. But it is very difficult because some of the music, music's a peculiarly personal thing, and some people didn't like some of the tracks. So we don't know. We actually don't know what to do. We don't know what. So do we? If you individualize the tracks, then you run into, you can't publish the papers because people say, well, they've got a different number, and the loudness of this track was. So you can't. The brain imaging becomes problematic. So, but clinically, individualizing and getting personal playlists might be better. There's a lot of research going on. There's one of our PhD students, Mendel Kaelin, set up a whole company called Wave Paths to actually try to optimize the playlists. And we probably, I think there will be some progress. But it's even more complicated, because if you play music that people don't like, it switches off the trip. So it's a challenging and interesting area, and there is a bit of research being done though with ayahuasca trips. So there's a Czech group that go out and take EEG equipment into the jungle and measure their EEGs during shamanistic ceremonies, and they're looking to see whether the different stages, the different musical bits have a different effect. So we may begin to get some inkling there as well.
You should check out the work of Mendel Kaelin, who's the student of David, and he started a company called Wave Paths, and what they're doing is they're using AI to combine a whole bunch of unique sounds so that when anyone listens to Wave Paths, they'll be listening to something completely new and unique. It won't have any spiritual undertones or anything like that. And I guess that's what you're trying to avoid in a trip is any connection to your priors or I suppose your default mode, right?
Yeah, that's right. You don't want to clash with people's perceptions. You want to facilitate rather than challenge, if you see what I mean.
In the meantime, massive round of applause for David and Sean.